All right, thank you all for coming today to this event on delivering forest action, avoiding false solutions, global pathways for climate and nature. This panel is co-hosted by EPN Biomass Action Network, China Green Carbon Foundation, the Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC, and Stand.Earth. My name is Jennifer Skeen, and I'm the Global Northern Forest Policy Director with NRDC. So today's panel is extremely timely. Some of you may have actually arrived in Baku directly from Cali, Colombia, the UN Biodiversity Conference, where parties established a process to drive greater cooperation between climate and biodiversity action, breaking down a decades-old barrier between the conventions. This was a really long overdue step toward addressing the fact that we cannot solve the climate crisis without protecting nature, and nature, conversely, depends on a stable climate. They go hand in hand, and so should the negotiations. The decision in Cali builds on progress that we saw almost exactly a year ago under the UNFCCC negotiations in Dubai, where the international community coalesced around the need to bring together action on nature and action on climate. And that was in the first global stocktake, which outlined the ambition necessary to avoiding catastrophic climate change. In that agreement, the parties really elevated the need to align climate and biodiversity action. So aligning the UNFCCC with the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which was signed in 2022 and laid the groundwork for the next decade of biodiversity progress. This is a reciprocity and an integration that really needs to keep on building. And it needs to start making its way into country level actions as well, and country level decision making, which is what our panelists are going to be discussing today. And this need for synergies is especially true when it comes to forests. The global stocktake, in addition to talking about alignment, also coalesced the parties around a commitment to halt and reverse deforestation and forest degradation by 2030, setting a very clear, unequivocal, and global target. So we have the stage set. We have the international community aligned around the importance of climate-nature synergies and aligned around the ambition needed on forest protection. But we have a lot of work to do to translate these commitments into reality on the ground. And unfortunately, when it comes to forests, our track record isn't so great. We've had pledge after pledge from the international community to rein in deforestation and forest degradation. And in turn, we've had broken promise to broken promise. According to the most recent Forest Declaration assessment, in 2023, 6.37 million hectares of forest were permanently lost around the world, resulting in 3.8 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions. And this doesn't even include forest degradation, and as a result, doesn't include the impacts from industrial logging. And as some of the panelists will talk about today, this is because there's been a long-standing legal fiction in forest policy that a clear cut is still somehow a forest. It's this Alice in Wonderland type scenario, not a tree without a forest, but somehow a forest without a tree. So a country is essentially allowed to clear cut, say, 500,000 hectares of forest each year, like Canada does, and claim near zero deforestation. And that's why the inclusion of forest degradation in that global stocktake was so critical, because scientifically that term does capture what is happening from industrial logging in these forests. And so on the degradation side, in 2023, globally, there was 62.6 billion hectares of forest that lost ecological integrity. And that's actually 10 times the area that was deforested, which really showcases the need to be bringing degradation alongside the deforestation commitments. And of course, too often, these impacts on forests disproportionately affect Indigenous peoples and local communities and their rights to the land. So this time, implementation of the commitments under the global stocktake have to work. It has to be different. We have to actually deliver on the commitments because we don't have any more time for failure. We're also now starting to turn our attention toward next year's COP30, which is going to be in Belém, Brazil, the gateway to the Amazon. So forests are literally going to be at the center of next year's negotiations. And so what we really need is for COP30 to result in pathways for forest and nature protection, particularly pathways led by Indigenous peoples. So here at COP29, NRDC and our partners are advocating for negotiators to build on what global leaders landed on in Cali and to really set the stage for greater coordination between nature and climate. Here in Baku, we also need to communicate to parties that their 2030 forest commitments are essential components of their national climate targets and plans. Only very few countries still to this day include deforestation and forest degradation in their nationally determined contributions. And that means that they're completely overlooking a critical component of their climate action. And this is particularly true of the wealthiest countries who continue, as we'll talk about today, to treat deforestation and forest degradation as a problem that's confined to the global south and not something that is actually found in their own borders. But forest-focused action is also very, very prone to false solutions. And that's the other theme of today, because false solutions like biomass, false solutions like unsustainable industrial logging are jeopardizing action on forests and action on nature. So as Brazil takes on this mantle of the COP30 presidency, a focus on forests also really needs to include a focus on avoiding attempts to hide harmful business as usual practices under a green veneer, as well as a focus on upholding Indigenous rights and elevating Indigenous voices. Fortunately, we have leaders who are helping ensure that we get there. We're honored today to have a distinguished all-women panel to talk about the vital role of forest protection to achieving the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement, and to bring in concrete examples that highlight both the kinds of solutions that we need and the false solutions that we desperately need to prevent. I'll give an introduction of each of the speakers, and then I'll turn it over to them. So Ms. Moradeke Adelekan is a career diplomat in the Foreign Service of Nigeria. She is a minister counselor and currently serving at the Embassy of Nigeria in Brussels. She is the desk officer of the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, representing Nigeria's interest in sustainable development and environmental issues. She holds a master's degree in diplomacy and international relations from the University of Complutense, Madrid, Spain. We also have Camila Romero, who is an anthropologist, environmental activist, and Indigenous peoples' rights advocate from Chile. She's a member of the Biomass Action Network, South America. Dr. Nuyun Li is the president of the Chinese Institute of Green Carbon and one of the founders of the China Green Carbon Foundation, one of today's co-hosts. Previously, she worked at the State Administration of Forestry and Grasslands and has been working in the area of forest carbon for more than 23 years. Her current work primarily focuses on carbon offsets and biodiversity credits, ensuring that they are approached in an ecologically oriented, holistic way. And then our fourth panelist is Tegan Hansen, who is the Senior Forest Campaigner at Stand.Earth, based on unceded Coast Salish territories in British Columbia, Canada. She is a tireless advocate for the protection of primary forests, including from the growing threat of Canada's biomass export sector. So thrilled to have all four of you here today. And to get us started, Moradeke, would you like to start?
Thank you for having me. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to read remarks on what Nigeria has done so far and also what we expect the global community to also do in terms of deforestation. So delivering the pledge to halt and reverse forest loss and degradation by 2030, enshrined in the first global stocktake and Glasgow Leaders Declaration on forest and land use is an urgent priority both for the climate and biodiversity. I'm happy to be joining you today to share the significant progress being made in Nigeria and across West Africa towards protection of our natural world and all its accompanying climate benefits. The intersection of climate and biodiversity is one we in Nigeria and the rest of West Africa confront daily. Our deserts are encroaching, our rainy seasons are falling, our savannas are burning, our wetlands are drying. Illegal logging is threatening key watersheds that provide fresh water to millions of our people. Our unique wild animals and plants are threatened with extinction within our lifetime. Our indigenous community are struggling to survive on the land where they have sustainably coexisted for millennia. Lacking ambition entails our communities becoming poorer, our food security is jeopardized, and our rural population are forced to relocate. Aligning climate and biodiversity action is essential. That is why it's so important for the negotiators here in Baku to respond to and build on the recent decision at the Biodiversity Conference in Cali to coordinate with other Rio conventions. We need to ensure alignment and coordination between our commitment on climate and on biodiversity. What we do to the land, we must do to climate and vice versa. At the national level, I'm extremely proud that we're reaching the completion of the adoption of an updated National Biodiversity Strategic Action Plan, which provides a clear and ambitious roadmap towards the preservation and recovery of our natural resources. In broader West African sub-region, I am thrilled to see our countries coordinating on the implementation of 30 by 30. And that is, we are on the clear path towards ensuring we are proactive and equipped to secure effective protection of 30% of ECOWAS region by 2030. These bold measures will significantly contribute to the protection of our forests, preserving our important role as lungs of the planet. As decision makers, we know that West African forests are fundamental to improving and safeguarding our local livelihood, as well as protecting global climates. In the ECOWAS region, the rate of deforestation and forest degradation between 2000 and 2015 was more than 13%, or about 704,000 hectares per year. In Nigeria, my country, we've lost more than 1 million hectares of tree cover over the last 2 decades. This is an urgent and immediate crisis for us and for our population. We are dedicated to meeting global forest goals as an essential safeguard for the future of our people. We're doing everything we can because we're clearly running out of time. We refuse to become passive spectators in the crisis unfolding in front of us. However, I'd like to caution against the perception that the fight against forest loss and degradation is a fight that should mainly be tackled by the global South. We are all affected by the harmful effects of climate change and losing and degrading tree cover everywhere in the world, and it has the consequences for everyone in the planet. As we cannot have a system that holds the wealthiest country to a different standard. Countries in our region are increasingly concerned that our global ambition is held back by fundamental equality in our forest policy structures, defined by a lack of unified responsibility and accountability between developed and developing countries. Solution for delivering on the commitment to halt and reverse forest degradation alongside deforestation must be inclusive in both tropical and non-tropical forests. Boreal and temperate forests in the global north are among the most carbon-dense, ecologically vital ecosystem in the world. However, primary and old growth forests continue to be clear-cut in alarming rates in the global north. For years, countries in the global north seem to have successfully limited the forest discussion solely to deforestation and degradation of tropical forests in the global south. The double standard places an additional burden on the global south, preventing us from addressing this problem as true partners. The dynamic must urgently change. We in Nigeria are treating the intersection of climate and biodiversity crisis as deeply felt priority. We need that same urgency to be felt everywhere. We must commit to a shared global responsibility for forest protection, both to increase ambition from tropical countries even more so to address destructive forest practices in the global north. And like we're doing in the tropics, to build more sustainable, healthy supply chains. The African continent as a whole seeks to secure the development of enhanced and common reporting, monitoring, and definitions to ensure global commitment to halt and reverse deforestation, forest degradation are implemented to the same standard within and outside of the tropics. We need to drive cooperation and collaboration across all forests. I encourage you to join us in this endeavor by supporting the development of an equity framework. We also need accountability for the allocation of financial resources. Ambition for nature cannot be disassociated from the ambition for nature finance. The two go hand in hand. If we do not deliver on nature finance, the commitments we made to protect the natural world will remain empty aspirations. Our global community committed to allocate at least 20 billion per year to developing countries by 2025. This is the modest step in the right direction. However, the world does not seem to be on the track to achieve it. We need the wealthiest nations to deliver what they have promised, while also increasing financial ambition under both climate and biodiversity convention. In conclusion, Nigeria is providing leadership, but we need the wealthiest countries to match and exceed it. We also need the climate negotiators to ensure a productive, ambitious response to the measures just taken days ago in Cali to drive coordinated action on climate and biodiversity. Please let us put our money and our efforts where our mouth is. The world can no longer afford to wait. I thank you all.
Thank you so much, Moradeke, for that presentation and for highlighting the example that Nigeria and ECOWAS West Africa are showing to the world in terms of nature protection and climate protection, with the advancement of 30 by 30, both domestically, but also being a champion for it internationally. A lot of the presentation at the top was doom and gloom, but really looking at the example that Nigeria is showing is a real source of hope. And I know that we were talking prior to this panel about the intense impacts that the people of Nigeria are already feeling from climate change. We're talking about the desertification in the north, and then erosion and flooding in the south. So really, this is an issue that is touching on the land sector, is touching on all facets of life for people who depend on the land in Nigeria. And I also really appreciated you bringing in that global perspective, and that Nigeria is not just looking at this issue in terms of how to advance ambition domestically, but also what are the forces internationally that are hindering greater progress. And of course, a key one on that is finance. As you mentioned, there's far too little that is being given or sent directed to tropical countries to ensure protection of these really critical ecosystems. But also, as you were talking about on the policy side, making sure that all countries are held accountable to the same standards, to the same expectations, and not sort of, getting pinched on the equity piece from both sides, both finance and on the policy piece. So look forward to exploring more of that in the panel discussion. But next up, I'll turn it over to Camilla.
Thank you. Yes. Well, thank you very much for being here to listen to our different work that we're doing, but the global efforts that we are here doing for life on planet Earth and for people, for those that we live in the ground. So we are here as Biomass Action Network, which is a global network of organizations worldwide that are united for the protection for forest, climate, and the biomass industry, which is one of the causes, the industries that is expanding and causing risk for the people in the global south mainly, and generating a lot of risk for the forest. So we are here as indigenous peoples, people that we come from very long from the very long territories, and we are here to express the concerns that we are experiencing in the ground. We are experiencing the climate crisis in our own bodies, and we feel how the forest is having risk around the biomass industry that is coming into the lands. In our network, we've been working and collaborating with people from different regions, and we see a huge risk on how communities and indigenous peoples, the rights of indigenous peoples are being impacted and vulnerating with the expansion of the biomass industry. We are very concerned on how the climate discussions are promoting solutions and a just transition discussion that is not including indigenous rights. We are concerned, but we are working to think how we can include people, how we can indigenous peoples be in the decision-making processes, as we feel, as we think that this is relevant and crucial to impact on climate discussions, but finally to enhance the climate action. As I am a member of the South American Working Group, we see in South America how the biomass industry is creating expansion of monoculture plantations. And we already know which are the impacts of monoculture plantations as pines, eucalyptus, and others. And these are one of the impacts on the water, on soil, on air as well. The biomass is producing and impacting on expansion of these impacts. We want to say that it is crucial to how we connect the local realities with the international discussions. For us, as we are here, we feel the commitment and the responsibility to elevate these voices from the ground and to elevate the issues around the forest. We are looking forward to what is going to be discussed in the next climate conference, and we are looking forward to have better conclusions and actions around the Just Transition Work Program and in the further resolutions on Article 6 and carbon markets, where we see that there is no recognition of the civil society demands. And we are very worried on how the corporate interests are being influencing these discussions. So just to conclude, we will keep and have in that we can reflect on what it is being promoted as renewable, as clean and not zero, and biomass must be reconsidered as a renewable source of energy in the large-scale production. Thank you.
Thank you so much for illustrating so viscerally just the impact that pursuing these kinds of false solutions is having on Indigenous peoples, on communities, and the way that this is impacting their livelihoods and their day-to-day reality. It's not just a climate issue, it's a human rights and Indigenous rights issue, and it's an issue of air protection, water protection, and Indigenous cultural protection. Looking forward to circling back on some of the ways that the biomass industry has leaned on these kind of false perceptions around its status as a renewable energy source and how that classification has really allowed it to have access to subsidies and all sorts of benefits that are allowing it to continue expanding into Indigenous territories. So thank you for that. We'll now turn to our third panelist, Professor Lee.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm glad to talking about the synthetic practice of the reading to climate change and biodiversity conservation. As you know, Chinese government always continue to carry out ecological restoration to promote the increase of the carbon sink. Dependent FAO report, the world forest vegetation carbon stocks increased about 1 billion tons from 2010 to 2020. Most of them come from China. We cooperation the CGCF, NRDC, and EDF, and the many domestic and international partners are always focus the promotion the forest carbon sequestration, also focus biodiversity conservation. Yeah, you know, this picture is CGCF cooperation with the CICC. The company is donating money to plantation and biodiversity conservation. This is a bigger company, SF Forest Carbon Neutrality Program, also focus the increase the carbon sequestration, also biodiversity conservation. NRDC, we cooperate with NRDC is always activity in the promotion the high quality development of the forest carbon sequestration and the biodiversity conservation, as well as green financial. The EDF action to promote the multiple benefits of the ecological carbon sinks. On the basis of the NBS, the Paris Agreement and the Kunming framework will be implemented. 8 years ago, I worked at SFA. We developed the methodology compare biodiversity conservation and the carbon sink to provide the high quality carbon production for volunteer carbon reduction and the carbon neutrality for enterprise and the public. We have researched and developed the carbon sink project and methodology for habitat conservation of fauna longus and implemented to pilot projects. You can see we completed for project documents, the methodology and the PDD and the monitor military, field military report. We get a certification report. This project have the 4.5 CO2 per hectare per year. But you know, this kind of the project is not only complete close product, but also benefits for local people and effective that protects the fauna longus habitat and increase the community income and so on. When the project is completed, where can I register and send the consistent emission reduction domain to the volunteer carbon reduction standard system, which is a GVER. It means it's green volunteer emission reduction. The above income can be registered and sent here. This is the GVER standard system. We have a different methodology. For example, the methodology guidelines and the project department guidelines and another 2 guidelines. How about the GVER organization? This is the organization structure of the GVER. The GVER is managed by executive community elected by the board of the directors, including the INBA, University of the British Columbia, Peking University, and another organization and the individual. In last year, by 28, we launched the GVER registering platform. We have known that the animal global funding gaps to protect biodiversity by 2030 were not to be between 700 billion and 1 trillion US dollar. Where is the money coming from? I think biodiversity credit is similar to carbon credits in concept and mechanism. Therefore, we try to develop biodiversity credits based on the carbon credits approach. Although the global standard system has not yet been unified, at least 48 countries have launched research and pilot work on credit system to varying degrees. So we cooperation with the Peking University. We select 3 of the most suitable and identified indicators for model and resulting in quantitative formula to calculate carbon credits that incorporate biodiversity protection. We get the methodology formula. At the same time, the methodology for standard biodiversity credits is also being revised and improved with pilot project planned for implementation. So, as you know, there's 3 types of the GVER products. We have the carbon credits as targets, multiple benefits carbon credits as targets, also biodiversity credits as targets. In future, we want to develop a multiple type and multiple benefits methodology. For example, we researched the biodiversity credits methodology, the project location in non-province. Also, we have a wildlife habitat conservation forest management carbon sequestration project methodology. The project is located in Beijing. I think most of this that contribute to the building a shared future of humanity and mitigation and adaptation to climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Lee. That's such a great illustration of leadership on uniting biodiversity and climate in a very, very concrete way, and looking at how this can be done in an effective, holistic process, and really appreciate the attention and focus on the co-benefits and bringing in so many elements into this system. I also noted one of the slides you talked about, sort of a 20-year crediting system, and that really highlights just how important it is to have very enduring, permanent protection of these forests to capture benefits for the long term. Great. Our final panelist is Tegan. Go ahead, Tegan.
Thank you so much. I'll just wait for my slide. Thank you. All right, so my name is Tegan Hansen. As Jen mentioned, I'm here from the unceded Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territories, also known as Vancouver, Canada, on the West Coast. And like Camilla, I'm part of the Biomass Action Network, and I think really wanting to touch on the impact of this sector, this growing sector on forests that are already incredibly degraded across Indigenous territories in so-called Canada. So forests across Canada on the West Coast where I'm from, in these temperate rainforests and the boreal, are among the most carbon rich on the planet. This is a photo of Tlaitli territory, of the ancient cedar trees there. But that's really a rare scene in British Columbia these days. This is a much more common vision of what the lands look like. This is Duquette's territory, so central British Columbia, and these clear cuts, as Jen mentioned, these are considered forests in Canada. And really what we're seeing increasingly are these log yards, which you would imagine are going into products like lumber. We're increasingly seeing trees logged from these forests going into wood pellet plants for export. So I have, sat beside these pellet plants in BC and watched logging truck after logging truck after logging truck unload whole logs into pellet plants. And so really, Canada has a long history of forest degradation on extracting resources from stolen Indigenous lands and profiting off of that. And as was mentioned, then calling this, not calling this deforestation, not taking accountability for the degradation, and putting the onus on other countries to meet those global commitments. So not only is that a historical issue, but increasingly now we're seeing that misused to support the growth of this new false solution, this supposedly renewable energy sector. Largely, we're seeing these trees exported to the UK, to Japan, South Korea, the EU, to generate so-called renewable energy. Most renewable energy globally is a type of biomass, a lot of that forest biomass. Why is that? So a huge part of that problem, as Camilla mentioned, there's a issue with the carbon accounting that's upheld by the UNFCCC. The idea is that biomass doesn't produce carbon emissions at the stack. In fact, especially woody biomass produces as much or more carbon as coal per unit of energy, but that is not counted. We know that that's the reality. We've measured that reality at biomass plants. The reason that's not accounted at the stack is this idea that forests are an existing carbon cycle, and in theory, a tree grows back. It'll recover this carbon, but that's not the reality. These are, what clear cuts look like up close. This is a clear cut that was specifically licensed to a wood pellet plant in British Columbia, Canada. And we know that these really, especially these slow growing, old primary forests, they will not recover the carbon that they once stored in our lifetime. Some of the studies from temperate rainforests in British Columbia say it might take 500 years, but likely they never will. So this is a huge loss, and also a cultural loss, a biodiversity loss that will never be regained. And how is this being allowed to persist? Well, as we talked about, a lot of the subsidies that should be going to support the green energy transition are supporting companies like Drax. Drax, which now owns most wood pellet plants in British Columbia, gets enormous amounts of subsidies to support their burning of wood from these communities. And Drax has shown that they know that they're getting wood from old growth and primary forests, and they're still persisting in their plans, and they're still getting support from governments like the UK and governments like mine in Canada. Just today, the Biomass Action Network released a new report showing the threat that biomass poses globally and what we can expect. So we're going to see a tripling of woody biomass supply for energy between 2021 and 2030. And that also includes requiring about 13 times the current levels of monoculture plantations to meet the supply. This is coming after a 50% increase between 2010 and 2021, including a 250% increase in global wood pellet production, to give you a sense of the scale of this problem and the growth. What does that mean? Well, obviously it means we're going to see a huge increase in the amount of biomass production, and that means more wood. It's going to mean more support for things like logging in countries like mine and Canada, and also more plantations to a huge degree. So what do we need? Well, here at the UNFCCC, we absolutely need to see this flawed carbon accounting remedied. We cannot consider biomass renewable writ large, and we have to see large-scale biomass energy excluded from NDCs, from the international and national targets. We also need to see nature harming subsidies stopped, and that's where also, to Jen's earlier point, the link between the Convention on Biological Diversity and the UNFCCC need to be solidified in a way that upholds Indigenous rights, especially. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Tegan. And yeah, those photos were quite devastating. And I think it really illustrate this whole time component that you're talking about as well. It's so much of the myth around sustainable forest management and biomass as a clean source of energy is this idea that trees and forests are going to grow back. But even under the best case scenario, that is not going to happen for a very, very long time. And we are talking about a matter of years, less than a decade, to get action right on climate to avoid exceeding 1.5 degrees, overshoot of which is going to be catastrophic. So thank you for highlighting that and how policy can really shape the value of something, and how through defining something as renewable through sort of cooking the accounting books, suddenly it can create this whole new false solutions industry around it. And the statistics you showed on that are terrifying and show why we really need to get this right. Great. Well, I would love to explore a few themes that I pulled out from your presentations. So I'll ask one or two questions, and then I'd love to open it up to the audience as well if you have any questions, so maybe be thinking of those. My first question is really building on a theme that Camilla, you mentioned, which is the need to elevate local and Indigenous voices in these international fora, and making sure that the discussions that are happening here are really reflecting the knowledge and the experiences of people who are on the ground. Maybe for each of you, maybe we can go down the row. How can the interests of people and communities be better represented here in the UNFCCC or across international decision-making more broadly? And also, how can this be done at the domestic level as well, to the extent that that is not happening?
Thank you for the question. Actually, we are here because I think that we Indigenous peoples, we are also very propositive as well. We're here not only to say about the negative impacts that are happening in our territories, but we are also here to propose from our experiences, from our way of lives, from our own traditional systems, which could be solutions for the climate crisis, climate change, and that can be respectful for lives, not only for Indigenous peoples, but for everybody, for human life. So these solutions and the proposals are crucial, that can have a better space, amplified in these discussions. But what happens in the reality is that Indigenous peoples, we face number of gaps and difficulties to engage on the UNFCCC. So much more people is coming to engage, but their own system is generating many barriers and a lot of gaps for them. So we need to overthink how the Indigenous peoples are well represented in this discussion, but giving as well transformations inside the system for them to be included. So for example, in the forest, for us, the forest has a special language and a special practices that must be as well recognized, how the diversity of perspectives can be included in the climate language as well. We have a lot of technical knowledge that doesn't include traditional knowledge and traditional systems. So, but as well, DCSB is having a lot of more discussion right now, and there is a platform for Indigenous peoples as well, and it must have more attention and inside the UNFCCC, I think, and it will have a lot of impact in how the outcomes. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. And I know just a few weeks ago in Cali, there were some decisions that started to address this issue of needing to elevate Indigenous representation and Indigenous voices, but still a very, very long way to go, as you mentioned. Murad, I wonder if you want to speak to this as well.
So for us in Nigeria, we believe in adaptation. It's very important because we know climate change is real. So what do we do? Most of our rural dwellers, they live close to the forest, a good number of them. They cut down the trees for firewood for cooking. So the government tries to encourage them that, yes, certain things is your lifestyle, but certain things needs to change. So we encourage that even when you have to go to the forest to cut down certain trees, we also encourage them, the government gets seeds for them to also make sure they replant some of these trees that's been cut down. And the government has also taken measures to designate about 10 parks across Nigeria as a no-go area. They are protected parks that cannot be, you can't go there to cut down trees or involve yourself in any illegal logging issues. So basically, we also bring our local people on board. What do they think solutions should be? They organize maybe different workshops. They provide different solutions. And then we ensure that we also coordinate and also cooperate with other international bodies and states on the best way forward. Best adaptation for each of our regions, and bringing our people on board to ensure that they also contribute from their own indigenous knowledge on how to preserve our forests and ensure we also contribute to the, biodiversity, ensuring that life is well sustained across different areas of the country. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that's such an important dimension that I don't think we've really pulled out yet today, which is bringing the local people on board to solutions, because it's not just trying to, protect people from industrial impacts, but also making sure that people and communities are protected in the solutions that we pursue, and making sure that they are stakeholders and participants and leaders in this process is so vital. Reminds me also that, one of the outcomes from last year was also the joint statement on climate, nature, and people being the third component of that. And it's often forgotten in these synergies conversations, but that has to be foregrounded, both in terms of protecting rights from impacts, but also making sure that we have a just transition and that these are economies and solutions that work for everyone. Tegan, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think building on what's been said, what we're really seeing in Canada, again, is the really encouraging, hopeful, impactful solutions for nature and climate are absolutely being led by First Nations, Indigenous nations. And we're starting to see Canada support that more and learn from that. And we really need to see that elevated and honored with much more integrity from governments like Canada that have a really bad track record, not only on infringing on Indigenous rights, but also in these negotiations on not upholding agreements that are actually going to support the protection of forests in a meaningful way. So I think that there's some good steps being taken, and we know that there's some really positive action that's come within, for instance, with Canada's position that's really been pushed and driven by Indigenous people, especially, as well as with some support from civil society. I think that there is a huge gap still between what's being negotiated here and the position and between what actually happens on the ground and the needs of what's on the ground. So, even in Canada, there's an enormous amount of climate impacts being felt from fires and floods, and it's disproportionately impacting Indigenous nations and communities who are also then leading on the solutions. So it's a huge burden. And I think we, as a global community, have a responsibility to alleviate that burden. And so one of the things that we've talked about is making sure funds are properly allocated. There's a huge amount of subsidies going to false solutions, to fossil fuel companies. Canada has a really high percentage of fossil fuel lobbyists on its official delegation this year. And so there's a lot of work that we can do to readjust those financial flows to go directly to communities who are leading on both the solutions and also on feeling the impacts. And that's should be a lot simpler than it has been.
Yeah, it really illustrates, I mean, the problem with these subsidies for industries like biomass is not simply the incentivizing of an industry, but also what is it keeping the funds, what are the solutions that are not getting the funding that they need. And, what you talked about between the gap between what's negotiated and what's actually happening on the ground and the experiences that people are seeing in terms of wildfires and other impacts is really devastating. But at the same time, yeah, really great leadership coming from Indigenous communities in Canada, and there needs to be a whole lot more. I know that there have been rounds of funding for Indigenous communities in Canada, but there's always way more proposals than actually get the money. So a lot more room to grow. Professor Lee?
Yeah, I'm a forest. I'm responsible the forest carbon sequestration office in China many years. In 2007, a successful the first CDM forest carbon sequestration training in the global. Also, we successful the first forest sequestration training in China. So we have we get some experience. Just like I mentioned, if I'm talking about the forest carbon sequestration training, we need to pay more attention to the high quality carbon credits. What is the carbon credits? I think this kind of the projects or project should at least have in additionality or statistic uniqueness and conservateness. Also, for ecological carbon sequestration projects, we should care about not only carbon benefits, but also no carbon benefits. I think it's the Paris Agreement talking about this issue, like the protection of diversity, helping the community economic growth and getting people in the community employed. In this way, we can build a sustainable project based and make the value of the ecological service come true. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And yeah, the idea of using systems like the one you're working on to create that value and create funds that will directly support and help communities on the ground in transitioning to new economies and facing climate impacts. So thank you for illustrating that. I have one more question, and then maybe we'll open it up to the audience. So the panel, the idea of today's panel was really to talk about very concrete examples of solutions and false solutions on the ground. The idea of climate nature synergies is one that's been talked about for the last several COPs, I think often at a very, very high level. I think that there's broad consensus, as I talked about at the beginning, of the need to really build on this acknowledgement of the need to foster synergies. But in terms of what that actually looks like, the solutions or the answers that we're getting from international policymakers are sort of few and far between. And we're hoping that here at COP29, we can start to change that dynamic. But the examples that you all provided today are so helpful in illustrating what this might actually look like on the ground, or what it should absolutely not look like on the ground. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you hope the international community can learn from what's happening in your country or region. What are sort of the key takeaways you hope that negotiators and global leaders will get from what is happening regionally?
For us in Nigeria, our dedication to adaptation, we have joined synergy with the other West African countries, the ECOWAS group. We are on board of taking, there is a 30 by 30 program. Basically what that means, we intend to use 30% of our land, inland water, and coastal marines to be strictly preserved to ensure that we rebuild our biodiversity both on the land and in water and forest. For us, it's very important, and we started with forest restoration by rebuilding the forest, planting new seedling, ensuring that those seeds grow to become forests. Those are part of what's very important for us. We're also willing to also collaborate with countries like Brazil, countries like Congo. Congo, yes, because of the Amazon, we're trying to look at what they are doing with the Amazon forest. Then in Congo, the Congo Basin as well. What have they done so far? And we also intend to also replicate some of these things in Nigeria. So for us, it's very important. We just don't want to talk the talk. We want to walk the walk. And we started with 10 parks, designated 10 parks that they are for biodiversity. And we do not intend to use them anything else other than to preserve our biodiversity. So we're sure with these examples, the world can see that Nigeria is not just talking the talk. We're also ensuring that we implement what we intend to do. And we hope that other countries will follow suit to understand the climate change is not just something we talk about, it's something we need to implement action to safeguard our future. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Yeah, the illustrating by doing is far too rare in the international space. So the work that Nigeria is doing to really showcase leadership on nature protection is inspiring, not just for its impacts in Nigeria, but for what that demonstrates and the norms that that sets internationally. And wonderful to hear about the collaborations with Brazil and the DRC and really looking at forests as a whole and information sharing and building sort of ways of approaching solutions and approaching these problems in a way that sort of lifts all boats and engages in that kind of cross-country exchange of ideas. Camila?
Would like to recognize the work that the civil society is doing in this space, and by pushing the commitment of parties to actually take action, and to take action that can include the work not only in that COPs, but also in the countries during the whole year. As an indigenous peoples and a community member as well, we come here, but we wonder as well what comes next. And we expect as well a commitment from the local. And so what we can learn from civil society is a huge intention of continuing the discussions, but not only in these high level conversations, but when we go back to the countries. The parties, they usually express the interest on being open to civil society. We are here as well expecting that we can have dialogues with the parties as delegates, as observers. So I think we must continue learning on how we have more spaces for these kind of dialogues between civil society and the parties and the delegates. Yeah.
That's such a critical dimension. I'm really glad that you raised that. And it really goes both ways, it sounds like, you know, in how civil society engages internationally and spaces created here also need to translate domestically, and then vice versa. And really learning how to create room for those voices to come through, no matter whether you're talking about the global level or the very local level. Deegan?
Yeah, I think on the false solutions front, something I would really encourage the international community to be aware of and to be wary of is some of the language around things like renewable energy, on things like what we really saw in Canada in terms of the growth of the biomass export sector was a framing around waste and using waste to produce, you know, a renewable energy, and actually that was sort of a smoke and mirrors in order to get access to this, to build up the sector and then get access to the forest. And so I also think as, you know, I'd really encourage the international community to rethink the framing on renewable energy to negotiate for real renewables that excludes, it should go without saying, but that excludes high polluting energy that harms people and nature. That should not be considered clean or renewable or an alternative to fossil fuels, which we must phase out. So I would really encourage countries like Canada and also countries looking at northern countries like Canada to sort of take that as a warning and to negotiate for language that doesn't help these sectors expand because we can't afford them to expand. And then also building on what others have said is really, really key. And I know we've said this before, but really underscoring that the leadership and the solutions we've seen in Canada have come when Indigenous peoples in Canada have been able to work in a way that ensures Indigenous people have control and management over their land. And that's been huge. And that is something that I think we need to see all over the world, and we need to see it soon, because that's truly like how we're going to ensure a rights-based approach to solving the climate and biodiversity crises.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Tegan. Yeah, I always love answers that sort of challenge existing paradigms and how things are defined and seen. And I think that answer you had about renewable energy and how that is viewed really encompasses so many of the themes that we're talking about here today. You know, something as simple as the term renewable, which we all sort of accept as meaning good for the climate, really leaves so much to be desired in terms of impacts to people and to nature. And I think that that's a great way of framing how we're thinking about approaching forest protection and forest solutions. Professor Lee?
Yeah, I think communities and the NGO are the frontlines exactly of the ecological protection. Both the governments and the enterprise should actively support and assist them in project implementation. I think it means give digital people more opportunities to discussing and participate in climate change adaptation and biodiversity conservation projects. Also, we should be increase the publicity to enhance resistance and the consensus on climate change adaptation and biodiversity conservation.
Thank you for that. Yeah, bringing it back to the communities again and making sure that their voices are reflected in the solutions is obviously absolutely critical, and giving people the chance to express what is going to be most useful to them and what kinds of solutions that they want to see, and making sure that that is heard at the international level as well. Great. Well, I'd love to now open it to audience questions. I don't know if we have mics or if it's just project. Maybe we'll start here. And if you could say your name and affiliation as well, that would be great.
Yes, thank you very much, Simone Lovia, EPM Ban. Thanks for all the great presentations. I had a specific question for Professor Lee, because in one of your responses, you already mentioned the challenges with integrity of carbon markets, of carbon offset schemes. And that's, of course, a huge issue at this moment in the negotiations, where there's a lot of concern that the weakening of rules will actually lead to, a lot of hot air, actually. And I just wondered how that referred to your specific projects, because, I mean, if you have three key concerns, I mean, one, permanence, you mentioned something, but I wasn't sure how that will be guaranteed in your projects. Leakage, of course, there has been concerns in the past that the Chinese government has a fantastic policy, having banned deforestation, basically, very successfully, conserved and also restored a lot of forests. especially also in the decade between 2010 and 2020. Wonderful work, but there's been a lot of exportation of deforestation as well, because the wood demand remained the same to specifically Far East Russia. So how can that be avoided with the kind of projects your organization is involved in? And last but not least, the additionality has been raised a lot the past year. As you probably know, there's been a research by a couple of renowned newspapers pointing out that they found that about 92% of all carbon offset projects credits were actually not additional. Recently, last month, another scientific paper, with profound scientific analysis, concluded that 84% of all carbon offset credits are actually not additional. And of course, that would be a huge problem because for the climate regime, because it means that you try to compensate new and additional emissions with non-new and non-additional removals. And of course, what suffers then is the climate that we are all fighting for. And in your first slide, you actually, I'm winding off, but in your first slide, you actually said that and reminded people of how successful the Chinese government has been up until 2020 of actually already halting deforestation and conserving, restoring forests. So I wonder how the additionality of your project can be guaranteed in that respect.
I think we're going to bring in the help of a translator.
So we're going to help Professor Lee to answer this question. Thank you so much for the question. So basically, we have a government regulations on monitoring and verification, reporting, and issuing. There's a strict rules and strict on the permanence, carbon leakage, as well as additionality. I would say definitely for the permanence issue, there's a permanence buffer account just in case there are any, for example, the disturbances, natural disturbances happening in the next coming years, and there will be carbon credits will be deducted from this buffer account, and this is the main strategy for the permanence. But of course, there's always like active monitoring involving the advanced technologies, recent the remote sensing, the utilizing the AI, and as for the carbon leakage, there always we need to stick to the regulations and the rules for the especially sticking to the principle of conservativeness, and just to make sure that we're not allowing all the carbon leakage to be accounted mistakenly accounted into the carbon credits. And for the additionality, we definitely want to make sure that we are having the real additional carbon credits for the projects. And we don't have many of those red plus projects in China. But all those news articles like The Guardian, they're claiming that more than 90% of the credits are phantom credits, and those are related to the Red Plus projects. But we need, the main work we do is about the afforestation and IFM. So it's a lot better in terms of additionality. And yeah, that's pretty much of our answer. Thank you so much for the question.
Thank you, and thank you for the question. Next question. Yes, sir, the red.
Thank you very much. My name is Daryl Bosu with Arusha, Ghana, an organization in Ghana, West Africa. So we're talking about coal-firing in the north. I'm thinking, so you're thinking about the big industries and all of that. But there's also a thin line where there's actually the use of biomass also in Africa for energy, domestic energy. And in recent times, a lot of industrial companies are even requiring some of these biomass for their boilers and all of that because they're also shifting. At what point do we say it's false, especially when it has to do with the use of indigenous communities and really deprived communities who don't even have access to energy? Because this is where it really matters. So how do we really, in defining false, how do we really ensure that we do not exclude others who really need it for their sustenance and for their basic needs? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Tegan or Camilla, do you want to take that one?
I can start. It's an excellent question. I think that there's, and this is really why I think it's important to focus, why I focus on the global north, because a country like Canada should not be profiting off of logging and exporting wood to a large scale power generation in the United Kingdom and calling it renewable. I think there is a difference of scale. And I think when we look at biomass globally, we should be looking to local communities to tell us, especially when it's really harmful, and trusting that guidance. So I know, for instance, on co-firing, and so this is something I didn't really talk about, but just to say quickly so everyone has context, one of the ways, we saw in the global stocktake a commitment around phasing out unabated coal. One of the ways countries can abate coal is by co-firing a small amount of biomass with coal, which doesn't actually reduce emissions, but does on paper. Countries like Indonesia are co-firing in about 52 coal plants now, and it requires an enormous amount of land to be converted into plantations. And we're hearing from people in Indonesia and local communities that that's having a horrifying impact on land rights, on the needs of local communities who rely on forests for their food and their culture, and they're being converted into monoculture plantations. So we should be looking to those communities to say, like, that's not a renewable energy strategy or an abatement strategy. In other countries, there are issues with biomass burning, but it might not be at the same scale, and people, do need to be able to turn to forests for their resources, and those forests need to be sustained. And so I think it's an issue of scale as well. And so it's why we can't give this writ large allowance to, biomass as renewable energy, because we will, as we have time and time again, see the exploitation from rich global north countries to profit off of this. And also for countries to infringe on the rights of indigenous peoples on their lands and local communities that rely on forests. So I think that those conversations of nuance really need to happen. And in the current framework, they can't happen. Yeah, that's my attempt at that.
Great. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Yes, you. No.
Thanks. Great event, great panel. Thank you. I'm Jason Funk from the Conservation International. And I wanted to come back to the issue of indigenous peoples and publish some articles looking at the fact that indigenous peoples have been kind of systematically excluded from carbon finance for the reasons that were just cited, that the fact that they've been protecting their forests effectively for generations means that it seems like it's not additional anymore. But when I talk to indigenous friends from places like Ecuador, they say we're on the front lines every day. It's very costly, difficult. We're under threat all the time. And this is not a free service to the world. It is a very challenging thing. But based on what I'm hearing on this panel, it seems like at the moment, the only way that those communities could access finance for forests is by liquidating them and either turning them into timber products or biomass for energy. So it seems like a perverse system we've set up here in some ways. So I'm just curious if you think there are ways to flip that the other way around so that finance can flow to the protection of forests. These additionality tests and things like that that were not designed for this purpose can be reconfigured so that these folks can get access to this finance for the good work that they're doing on the ground, and that they have other options besides just liquidating their forest resources. Thanks.
Thank you, Jason. Does anyone want to start on that?
Okay. Yeah, one of the main rights that is crucial when we talk about plantations and forest management is the self-determination of indigenous peoples. That it's a crucial right that it's recognized international and also local, that must be not only, it must be recognized through all the process and with a vision of integrity. For indigenous peoples, the principle of integrity that can include how we think about the next generation that can still have access to the lands is vital, and usually is not considered by the Occidental thinking, right? So we must secure that the next generation can have access to the land. So we can work for that. We need to work on how the governance is also in part of participation, and the free, prior, and informed consent, as always, must be in the head of every policy around this. Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
Does anyone else want to add anything? I can add something as well. Yeah, and thank you for your question, Jason. I think that's an incredibly important point of how are we going to be valuing and funding Indigenous peoples and local communities who are doing the hard work of protecting the land and ensuring that it is an enduring protection. And I think that there are a lot of conversations to be had around what that looks like. But certainly one thing that we've been talking about is unlocking new forms of finance. And one way of doing that is through redirecting these harmful subsidies towards communities and creating the value there rather than creating it in a false sort of accounting manipulated solution. Other ways are really trying to invest initially in establishing sort of indigenous-led sustainable economies and ensuring that those are going to be self-perpetuating, and it's not sort of this constant cycle of relying on government funding. So finding pathways to doing that. And I think we're also seeing innovative new solutions in the form of things like the Tropical Forest Forever facility, which are starting to look at, how can we look at protection of forests forever, and in a way that doesn't sort of necessarily trigger a lot of complicated questions around carbon markets and carbon generally, and looking at protecting forests for the value that it has standing as a forest. And that brings in so much more than the carbon question. But yeah, it's a topic for a much longer discussion. Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Alex Marab. I'm here with the party from Liberia, West Africa. So my question is kind of twofold. I think the first part is probably for Dr. Lee, and it focuses on the projects that you were talking about when you were up there that focus on biodiversity credits and carbon credits. And I was curious, is there any documentation or a place in which I can access annual profit projections or estimations for those projects? Because for a place like Liberia, which is trying to build itself up, and at one point our GDP was 10%, or excuse me, 10% of our GDP was focused in logging and forestry. If we do away with that and we don't have another way in order to generate the income, we're trapped in that loop in which this gentleman was talking about, which is we don't have funding to create innovation, to create industry. So now we're begging those same corporations to give us money to save them from the problem that they created. It's a frustrating thing. This is my first COP, by the way, so I'm absorbing all of this and I'm like, what is going on? But I'm just curious as to if I can find that information. That's the first part. Second part is if we know that our industry or generation of income is what's going to guide us out of this pitfall, and we have a huge amount of traditional people who have maintained the forest in a certain way that's good, if we aren't the ones that's generating our profit, then also we aren't the ones that's defining integrity and moral process or structure to help us move forward. So how would you all recommend that we get through that or figure that out? Okay, that's it.
Great, thank you. I don't know for. Maybe just as an initial point, also following up on Jason's question, one other element of all of this is there's obviously far insufficient finance going toward forest protection generally, but also the finance that is getting moved is not finding its way to Indigenous communities and the people on the front lines who most need it. So there's also a conversation to be had around how do we reform those money flows and ensure that the money that is coming in to fund protection in tropical forests is actually reaching those communities on the front lines. So, I was just at a dinner a couple of weeks ago with some Indigenous leaders where that was sort of top of mind, especially when we're looking at new solutions like the TFFF, is how is that going to fix the problem of money getting generated, but it somehow getting log jammed in the process.
Okay, thank you so much for the question. Regarding the documents of those projects, in terms of methodology and project design document, we will publish those documents in the early next year, 2025. And you're welcome to keep in touch with us. And yes, and regarding the project design document of the existing projects, we are happy to discuss with you further after maybe after this meeting, and we can connect. Thank you.
Does anyone want to take the second part of the question?
What I think I can add to this is, okay, we know from developing world, most of the time our rural dwellers, they rely on this forest for survival. So what I think can be done is we can look for alternative sources of income for them. Say, for instance, rather than cut down all the trees, why not look for maybe cash crops, trees to plant, harvest and sell? What about waste, turning waste recycling in a local way, things that they can also use within the community? So it's about going into the country, looking for local knowledge that can be domesticated at these rural communities. So you look at alternatives such as cash crops, for instance. What are the cash crops that can survive within that community? What are the wastes that can be recycled within that community? What are the handiworks that we can teach our women to do? How do we build a community? Other innovative ways to earn funds and resources. Take, for instance, in some communities in Nigeria, rather than encourage them. So what we do is when they cut down these trees, we also encourage them to replant, forest restoration. We tell them the importance and the local way how this forest, rather than cut off everything, take some branches, replant, and then let's look for other cash crops that we can grow for maize, corn, things that are fast cash crop that they can sell, earn some money, and also teach them handiwork on what they can do so that they do not just rely on a particular source of income alone to reduce, to reduce the deforestation. Because at the end of the day, the more we have this issue of deforestation and land degradation, this is when this is when erosion starts, and they are forced to move from their communities to other communities. So the best way to allow them to stay back is to encourage them to look for alternative means of resources, and also encourage, planting new trees, other sources of cash crops, just to, diversify sources of income rather than rely on a particular source of income.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to weigh in? I think we have time for one more question. Maybe I'll get it from this side of the room. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Paige Stevens. I'm a student delegate from Indiana University, and I want to ask about the preparations for COP30 in Beijing in terms of forest and forest action. So for any of the panelists who want to answer, do you think that we can expect to see an increase in forest action in the next year? And how can we use the next COP as an opportunity to further forest action? And just in general, do you feel optimistic or hesitant about the next COP occurring in the Amazon? Thank you.
It's a great question, and could spur a very long conversation. Who wants to start?
Just briefly, I think there's a lot of work to do in advance of the next COP. I think it's I am optimistic because of what I've heard from Indigenous peoples and nations as they look to the next COP in Amazonia. I think that we as civil society have a lot that we can do to promote, the fossil fuel phase out, fossil fuels out of Amazonia, fossil fuels out of forests globally. And these are struggles that we've been having for a long time. And I think the solidarity that we can build internationally and the lead up to this next COP, it could be really powerful and transformative. And I think we have to be prepared to be incredibly ambitious and bold and be willing to upend some of the structures that we've discussed here that are still really foundational to the COP, and just be willing to think a little more about what actually needs to happen. And I think that is a cause for hope. And I think we should be hopeful and determined and realistic about the next COP as well.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I would like to add that what happens here will impact for next year, definitely. So if we are we want a successful COP13, we should be working right now to have good outcomes and in all. And we have a lot of work and a lot of challenges to unite civil society. Indigenous peoples had a lot of expectation as well to be included in the agenda. We're working to have a good connection with the ministry, through the ministry and the government of Brazil. But I think as we have a good expectation, it could be a good opportunity, but also could be a good opportunity for companies. So, yeah.
I would say that we are being optimistic. Why? Brazil has the Amazon. So the importance of Amazon and the forest are things that we're optimistic that will be concentrated on and people will talk about. And like other speakers said, of course, decision starts now, discussion starts now. So whatever we gain from this COP, we'll take it forward to the next COP. And then we hope when people see the Amazon, when people see the importance of the Amazon, both in diversity and forests, we'll take it from there. Thank you.
Great, and that's a perfect place to leave this panel, and appreciate you teeing up a strong wrap up with that question. I think what we've really seen here today is there are so many great examples of leadership on the ground, but also a lot of cause for vigilance and wariness as we approach any kind of conversation that's focused on forests and the climate nature nexus. I think from last year's global stocktake, from the recent decision in Cali, the table is really set for very strong, ambitious action and paradigm shifting action on forests, and really bringing together forests and climate in a way that we have not seen before. But I think at the same time, as the panelists have talked about today, there's a lot of false solutions out there. And a lot of the narratives currently with the paradigms around how we define renewable energy, how we define deforestation, really favor a lot of the business as usual paradigms and narratives, and provide a very easy space for problematic industries to come in and try and co-opt things in their direction. So I think there's a lot that can be done over the next few days here in Baku to make sure that we are centering climate and nature and setting up a process to continue that collaboration with the CBD and the UNCCD to really start the discussion around things like forest carbon accounting and how to make sure that we are setting up systems that are going to allow us to deliver on the global stock take and actually halting and reversing deforestation and forest degradation globally. And also pulling the conversation away from where we absolutely cannot afford to have it go around those false solutions. But yeah, maybe we'll leave it there. I know we're at time, but really appreciate you all coming to our panel today. Really appreciate all the panelists and your incredible insights on this really timely and important topic. So if you can all join me in thanking our panelists. Appreciate it.